Fog clung to the pilings of Brogan Cove like a damp shawl, softening the edges of nets, buoys, and the rust-pitted hulls of the day's returning fishing boats. The harbor had a rhythm, a breathing pattern learned over generations. The gull's morning squabble, the low drone of diesel early in the dawn, the creak of rope on cleats, and the steady reports over VHF from skippers checking in. It was a small coastal town of weathered wood and practical superstition, where the sea-fed families and the conditions of the next tide were as much a part of the conversation as the price of scallops or fuel. Captain Mira Dawson had been fishing these waters since she was 16. Her father had taught her to read swell patterns by the way the harbor glassed over before a shift in weather, and the old-timers still swore by the smell of the air before something changed. Her boat, the Evelyn May, was modest, a 32-foot trawler with a patched wheelhouse and a crew of 3 including her younger brother Jonah, who'd come home from a stint on a deep-sea freighter to help with the family business. The harbor's economy depended on their catches of cod and herring, and the morning's haul had been promising. Clear skies, a light offshore breeze, and a rising early tide pushing good water through the channels. Down the breakwater, a seal hauled out on the sun-warmed concrete. The harbor seal, locally known as Pip, was a familiar figure to the fishermen. He wasn't owned, protected by law, and mostly tolerated for the way he entertained the kids with flips and lazy dives. He had a mottled coat, dark eyes that reflected the sky, and a bark that, when he was content, was a short woof that made the gulls scatter in annoyance. No one thought much when he bobbed near the docks, except when the usual rhythm shifted. A bark here, a longer stare there. But those were stories told over coffee and waved away as, that's just Pip being Pip. Underneath the apparent calm, the ocean held a complexity that most in town took for granted. The cove was shaped by an underwater canyon that channeled swell energy from the open ocean. Normally, its effects were predictable and accounted for. But the recent weeks had produced a subtle change. A distant storm far offshore had generated sets that, by all accounts, should have dissipated in open water. Instead, they began to interact with a rare, deep countercurrent feeding into the canyon's mouth. The resulting constructive interference, multiple wave trains coinciding in phase, was slowly building energy in ways that no one ashore could see. The NOAA buoy readings, misaligned slightly by instrument drift and delayed reporting, did not flag anything alarming. The ocean, however, was already whispering. Mira and Jonah prepped the Evelyn May for the afternoon haul. They went through their checklist: engine oil, radio check, lines, radar calibrations, while the crew drank strong coffee and listened to the harbor chatter. The other skippers, like old Gus at the end slip and young Elise with her crab skiff, went about their own preparations. The morning was good enough that no one felt the need for the more cautious talk that came with the gulls' sudden quiet, or the way the mist had formed a thin, unusual veil over open water, slightly discolored and making distant buoys look like ghost lights. The community's safety protocols were basic, but solid. They held briefings when fog thickened or storms approached. Today, the sun warmed without a breeze strong enough to carry a warning. Pip, the seal, dove off the breakwater into the channel. He swam in lazy circles, breaking the surface every few seconds to bark. Once, twice, then again, more insistently. It was the kind of sound the fishermen heard and let fade into ambient noise. But this morning, his barks lengthened, turned rhythmic, and carried farther. He swam closer to the anchored boats, then back toward the open mouth of the harbor, always barking as if trying to draw attention to a movement on the water no one could yet feel. Jonah heard it over the clank of a cleat, looked up, and squinted down the channel. "You hear that?" he asked Mira. She shrugged, smiling. "Pip's being dramatic again." The seal barked again, this time a high pulsing sequence that made even the gulls pause. Something under the surface had shifted. Pip had felt the way only those tightly integrated with the current could. By midday, the harbor buzzed with the usual energy. Boats were easing out past the breakwater. Nets were being tossed aboard, and the radio frequencies carried banter and weather checks. Pip, however, did not return to his usual leisure. He made a circuit just outside the harbor mouth, barking sharply, then swam in close to the anchored skiffs, slapping the water with his flippers, as if pointing, as if agitating. His usual playful dives were replaced by a low, thrumming agitation, the kind of behavior that, if observed more than once, might suggest he sensed a dissonance in the water's movement. He surfaced near the Evelyn May, stared up at Mira with dark, unwavering eyes, and barked again, longer, urgent, almost a cascade. Bark, 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 pause, bark, bark. Mira finally walked the dock to the rail. "What's up, Pip?" she called, half in jest. The seal's next bark cut under her voice, and he slapped the water, sending a ripple outward that flashed against the sunlight with a strange, outward pulse. Jonah came over, wiping salt from his hands. "He's been doing that for 10 minutes. That's not his normal." Gus, who was tightening his own line nearby, had stopped with his wrench in hand. He watched the seal with the narrowed eyes of a man who had been at sea too long to overlook a change in animal behavior. "He's got that look," Gus muttered, "like when the porpoises vanish before the fog rolls in." Elise slowed her skiff, listened to a slurring radio weather report, and saw the seal's repeated barks. Mira, feeling a flicker of unease, keyed her handheld into the harbor-wide channel. "All boats, this is Evelyn May. Has anyone noticed any swell changes beyond the mouth?" Static crackled. Then Jonas, on the Mariner's Pride, responded, "Nothing unusual. Sea's calm, just a little undercurrent pull, maybe. Pip's making a fuss." A few others chimed in with similar dismissals. The harbor master, Tom Fields, who had spent decades watching the water, came down the pier. He had seen seals warn of approaching predators before, never waves. He leaned over the railing, watching Pip swim in tight, looping spirals, barking toward the open sea, then abruptly changing direction to slap near the harbor entrance. "What do you think he's yelling about?" Jonah asked. Tom's gaze drifted to the far horizon, where a faint line of swell could just be seen, an anomaly in the otherwise flat expanse. It was subtle, an odd rising swell in the distance that didn't fit the expected wave period, almost imperceptible unless one had walked the docks enough to feel it in their bones. Tom's skin, worn by salt and sun, tightened. He's not being dramatic. He's seeing what we aren't. Take in the gear tight, secure the boats, hold off the bigger nets for a bit. I'm not saying anything's coming, but I'm hearing his bark, as if it's saying, "Watch." Words spread slowly, from an amused joke to a cautious murmur. The harbor's informal radio chain lit up with Pip's acting odd, Tom's calling a soft hold. Fishermen double-checked moorings. The youth on the docks, used to seeing a seal or two, whispered. Pip didn't let up. He swam toward the far breakwater, barking, then turned, and with a burst of speed, cut across the channel to the Evelyn May, circling her stern and continuing his urgent chorus. Mira, now looking at the water more closely, noticed for the first time that the slight swell she had dismissed earlier was building differently. Faintly, the water's surface had a vertical tension, swelling and then dropping with a cadence that didn't match the wind. The seal's behavior had anchored her attention. Behind the harbor, weather patterns had conspired to be invisible on routine forecasts. An eddy far out in the North Atlantic had fused temporarily with a focused swell line from a passing storm, its energy funneled through the canyon's bathymetry and condensed by underwater topographic reflections. Rogue waves, by definition, are rare, usually brief, and often dismissed as sailors' tall tales when unanticipated. This one was growing in the dark basin beyond the visible line, building amplitude as multiple waves, aligning in phase due to the particular geometry of pressure ridges and underwater ridges. The local oceanographers would later, in post-incident debriefs, describe it as a transient, constructive wave packet, a convergence that brought a significant crest to the surface without a corresponding increase in the usual surface agitation. It was the kind of swell the harbor's instruments calibrated for average storm pulses might miss until it was nearly upon them. Pip's acute pressure sensitivity, through whiskers and mechanoreceptors, picked up the unusual downward pull and then rebound in the water column before any boat felt it. His playful flips away from that zone were replaced by purposeful approaches, and he began to track the wave's subtle approach, barking at intervals that reflected its proximity. His body tensed when the energy passed, and he'd circle, throwing his head back and releasing a series of sharp barks that threaded the harbor's white noise. The harbor evolved from quiet preparation into whispered coordination. The fishermen, under Tom's informal guidance, hauled in the last of the mid-sized nets to reduce potential drag and damage. The larger trawlers, which would have normally pushed past the harbor mouth that day to ride the calm to their usual fishing ground, held close. The youth crews helped lash the boats with extra lines, cleats double-checked, fenders repositioned. Mira radioed into the nearby marine traffic harbor control, holding position near entrance. Pip's been barking nonstop. I don't like this sound. Keep the lobster skiffs in tight. Elise, who had gone out to check a gear line, circled back and found Jonah helping a new apprentice coil line. "You seen this?" she asked, pointing to the gentle swell rolling in, its slope subtle but building, an almost invisible mound that began to rise a little faster than the ambient calm. "Yep," Jonah replied, glancing back toward the seal, whose barks now had a layered cadence, almost a rhythm of two quick yips, followed by a longer wail, then a pause before repeating. He made a half-joking, half-serious comment. "He's calling the tide in, and it's not just the tide." The harbor master radioed the small cluster of recreational boats to avoid venturing beyond the harbor for the time being. The town's small cafe near the docks stilled. The usual breakfast customers watched from windows as the fishermen moved with more intentional slowness, their practiced movements taking on a cautious choreography. That unease, sparked by a seal's bark, rippled into the community. The harbor's old faithfuls, those who'd seen storms come from clear mornings, started to drag up their own internal files of what-if scenarios. The word rogue floated briefly in Tom's internal monologue. He didn't say it aloud, but he tightened his lips and ordered an extra set of line checks. Pip's focus shifted slightly. He moved out beyond the harbor's shelter line and swam parallel to the entrance, barking toward the open water, then turned back, swimming quickly along the breakwater, making sure every boat heard him. He began to surface in a pattern that now mirrored the developing wave's arrival, calling earlier, then again, with a keener pitch as the swell grew. He wasn't panicking. His body did not suggest disorientation. It was a clear alert, an animal amplifying an unspoken undercurrent into a sound humans could interpret if they chose to listen. The moment of decision arrived in incremental beats. The rogue wave, still far enough that it was a visual ripple if one knew where to look, carried a silent threat of overwhelming the harbor's normal quiescence. Tom, sensing the convergence of unusual seal behavior and the altered swell, rang the small harbor alarm. Not a full-blown siren, but the low toll of a buoy bell, and the radio code phrase they used for hold, evaluate. He didn't order immediate evac. Instead, he asked all boats to pull in tight, reduce open deck clutter, and keep crew below deck if not needed topside. School children, who had been on a scheduled field trip aboard the docked Seabright to learn about nets and local ecology, were ushered down gangway, and their teachers, initially confused, followed instructions with reflexive discipline. Elise, who had a small fishing partnership with a neighboring harbor, had turned her skiff around before the harbor mouth. She held onto the rail of the breakwater as the water's tension built, a slow, increasing pitch under the surface that no instrumentation had flagged, but that she could feel through her boots and the flex of her hull. She shouted over to Mira, "We keep the crews low? Maybe tie the extra lines on that stern cleat?" Mira nodded, gripping her own railing. "If that thing comes, I want the Evelyn May to ride it, not be dragged or rolled." Jonah tied a redundant snubber from the stern to the inner piling. Elise helped Gus tighten his fender arrays. The harbor's small fleet had by now moved from casual preparation into a quiet, unified bracing. The local kayak tour operator, a young woman named Rena, who had been about to launch her group, called back their clients and canceled the tour. "Just until we know what's up," she said, deferring disappointment into prudence. Pip's barking increased in intensity, shorter intervals between bursts, and each time it had a particular cadence that the fishermen began to notice. It was almost as if he was layering urgency over reassurance, telling them to stay put but to remain aware. His movement took him to the outermost buoy, and he slapped the water there with a hard, deliberate motion. A ripple radiated from that spot, intersected the approaching swell, and on the surface, it created a minor interference pattern. Nothing dangerous to the untrained eye, but a physical intersection that made the wave's leading edge quiver, showing its true size in a stuttering reflection. The rogue wave's crest, which at open water would have simply risen and broken gently, gathered in the funnel of the canyon's geometry. It picked up energy, steepened, and the amplitude grew higher than expected. The leading edge sloshed toward the harbor, and the sea surface in front of the breakwater bulged. A slow rising of water that seemed to come from nowhere, a tank of momentum stacking into a sudden ridge. Tom, seeing the bulge and hearing the abrupt change in Pip's barks, now frantic short bursts layered atop each other, made a terse call. All hands down, brace for a swell, no one under unsecured rigging, keep everything tied. Hulls centered, do not attempt to adjust under wave. The fishermen, conditioned by decades of shared implicit understanding, ducked, secured hatches, and waited. The rogue wave arrived not as a monstrous wall of water out of myth, but as a sudden, steep surge, an unnatural swell that pushed through the harbor's mouth with concentrated force. The initial rise lifted boats gently, then, with a weight that involved the whole structure, as if the sea had taken a deep, sudden breath beneath them. The crest, shaped by the canyon's constricted geometry, had enough energy to overwhelm typical harbor reflections and surge water levels significantly for a short interval. On the Evelyn May, ropes groaned under load but held. Her crew, low in the wheelhouse by design, felt the boat rise, then settle, then surge again. The harbor's bulkheads took the impact, and water sloshed over the inner quay in a rolling pressure wave that would have, without preparation, thrown unsecured gear, snapped lines, and potentially spun lighter skiffs into dangerous collisions. Lines tightened, fenders squirmed against pilings, and some smaller open skiffs rocked violently, but, due to the redundant lashings in place, didn't capsize. Elise's crab skiff, normally prone to a rollick on strong tide shifts, took the swell squarely and flexed like an old friend's leather, but held its alignment. Gus, at the end slip, felt the surge in his spine and grunted, eyes wide, then looked down to see the bulk of water retreating as quickly as it had come, leaving an altered current in its wake. The rogue wave's height peaked in a narrow band. The harbor's prepared vessels experienced a steep increase in draft, then a sudden drawdown as the water receded, exposing parts of the harbor floor that were normally hidden. The wave's energy dissipated in the protected cove, spilling harmlessly into the inner channels instead of shoving out beyond with destructive feedback. The breakwater, engineered for typical storm surges, flexed but didn't fail. Some of the older masonry pieces shifted, but no major damage occurred. The contrast between what had been braced and what might have been was glaring. Untied boats and unsecured gear outside the main cluster, had they been in the open or unprepared, would have been tossed, lines snapped, and collisions severe. When the water settled, silence held for a beat, then the low whistles of relief, the creak of ropes settling, and the shared looks on the docks. Pip surfaced in the middle of the harbor, floating with a graceful bob, and let out a few short barks, not panicked, but a soft, satisfied roll, as if confirming that the alert had been heard and the wave had passed without catastrophic consequence. News spread through town in the hours that followed. There were stories spun in the cafe. The day Pip barked and the sea listened, the local paper headlined the next morning. The harbor's debrief was measured. Tom gathered the captains at the municipal hall. They reviewed what happened: the unusual swell formation, the seal's persistent behavior, the timing of preparations, and how those actions intersected with the rogue wave's passage. They noted what had gone right: redundant lashings, the decision to keep crews low, immediate compliance with the soft hold, and crucially, the attention paid to an animal's behavior that had no protocol but had been honored. Marine scientists from the Regional Aquatics Institute were called in. They deployed wave buoys to sample the post-event profile, and later produced a technical report classifying the event as a rare, high-energy rogue wave induced by constructive interference in the canyon, whose crest would, given no preparation, have triggered severe damage to the lighter fleet, possibly causing insurance-level losses or worse, injuries or lost boats. The report included a section titled Biological Sentinel Input, outlining how the harbor seal's behavior provided a non-instrumental, real-time catalyst for human preemptive action. Dr. Elise Tran, a behavioral ecologist, was especially interested. She wrote, Pip's vocalization and spatial persistence appear to have functioned as a rapid gradient alert to the unusual subsurface energy shift, consistent with sensory detection of pressure anomalies not readily perceivable by human instruments. A small community meeting followed. The fishermen, usually private about their near misses, openly credited the seal. Mira stood up and said, "We fish with the ocean. We listen to weather. Today we also listened to a neighbor who has no voice but a bark. That made the difference." Tom proposed a modest plaque at the harbor's entrance. "To the day, the seal warned us." Maya, a local girl who had been on the dock with her grandparents, brought her own sketch of Pip in action, adding a note card. "Thanks for keeping our boats safe." The harbor community, which had always had a handful of quiet customs, like leaving fresh fish scraps for the seals, now added a more intentional nod. Extra slack on the dock was kept open so Pip could haul near without entanglement. Youngsters were taught on field trips to watch, but not disturb such sentinel behaviors. The scientific discussion did not morph into myth. The local council and environmental liaisons were careful in framing the narrative. The wave was a physical phenomenon, predictable only in its unpredictability without multiple data streams. The seal's barking was instinctual, likely triggered by pressure gradients and current shifts he felt through his whiskers and body in the water. Humans had interpreted that alarm, elevated it through coordination, and that interplay, biological cue meeting attentive culture, saved assets and possibly lives. Funding was quietly allocated to supplement the harbor's monitoring with a small behavioral observation log where unusual animal behavior related to water shifts was noted along with instrument readings for future pattern correlation. Seasons changed. The plaque, once installed, weathered to a soft patina. The story of the day Pip barked before the wave became a staple portion of the harbor's new crew orientation. New apprentices were told to watch the water but also watch the watchers, an old captain's shorthand for paying attention to both instruments and animal behavior. The harbor installed a modest camera with a motion sensor near the breakwater that recorded Pip's usual patrol patterns, anomalies, longer barking sessions, unusual approaches near the mouth, were flagged for human review. The seal alert log sat beside the tide charts in the harbor master's shack, annotated with dates, times, and any coincident water oddities. Over time, some of those earlier entries correlated with micro-swell events, fish migrations, and even the early detection of small underwater landslides near the canyon's throat. Pip remained, a gray-brown streak of presence in the harbor. He still played, still dove, and sometimes barked at nothing that fishermen later learned meant the tide was turning or the current was shifting. Children visiting on summer tours learned the difference between his playful barks and the persistent layered ones that had become associated with warning. They'd draw him with speech bubbles in their school projects. "I barked, you listened." The local artist painted a mural on the side of the cafe showing a seal mid-bark, with a cresting wave behind and fishermen with ropes secured, a tribute that balanced respect and realism. Mira, now older by a few seasons, would sometimes stand on the dock in quiet mornings and glance toward the water. She'd whisper, not theatrically, but with practiced gratitude, "Thanks, Pip," when the seal surfaced nearby. Pip would look up, blink, then slide under a log and go about his business, as if nothing at all had happened. The harbor's resilience had quietly deepened. The day the rogue wave came and the seal's bark turned into a town-wide alert became a point of reference in regional emergency planning. Other coastal communities, hearing the story, started their own lightweight, wild signal logs, noting cormorant flight patterns before wind shifts, Crayfish burrow openings before sudden temperature drops, and in one storm-prone inlet, a heron's unusual flight path preceding a flash surge. The interplay of natural watchers and human systems formed a patchwork early warning mesh that didn't replace technology. It augmented it. And somewhere in the tide-changed current, when the harbor was quiet and the fog lifted like breath from sleeping wood, the river's old pulse and the ocean's new whispers still played out. Pip, with a glint in his wet eyes, surfaced, shook, and barked, a sound that had long since become, in the quiet ledger of that harbor, both ordinary and extraordinary.